everybody. I hope some of you have been here before and you remember me. My name is Dr. Lee Farrow. I am a professor at Auburn University at Montgomery in Montgomery, Alabama. And I have given two talks already for the American Center on various aspects of life in the South. And today I'm going to be talking about things to see in the South. So some of the main attractions in the South. I myself am a born and bred Southerner. So I grew up in Louisiana, and then 24 years ago, I moved here to Alabama when I took a job here at Auburn University at Montgomery. So I've spent my whole life living in the South, and so I'm very familiar with lots of the fun things to do and see in the South. So let's see if I can get my presentation up. There we go. So I will say that it was very hard to choose things because there's a lot to see here, of course, as there would be in any region as large as the South. So first of all, let's just kind of talk about where is the South. So again, for some of you who have maybe joined these presentations before, you're familiar with this map. I've shown it before, and it shows you this sort of general area that's considered the South. Now, the states in red are considered what we call the Deep South. So this is sort of the area where, for example, there were lots of slaves and plantations, and where I think values and behavior continue to be a bit unique compared to other parts of the country. Some of these other areas, I honestly hardly consider the South myself. Oklahoma just never seems like the South to me, but it's included in this map that I found. And then another place that's always kind of surprising to remember is in the South is Washington, D.C. It's actually hotter there today than it will be here in Alabama. So it is a place that is still considered part of the South. So let's look at some of the places you would want to visit if you came to the South. So again, I'm not going to be able to hit every state and every main attraction, but these are some things that I thought would be highlights. So in Florida, right, the state of Florida has a number of nice things to offer. And one of the things that people go to Florida for are their beaches. All along the Gulf Coast, on the Gulf of Mexico, Florida has some really lovely beaches with white sand and clear water, as you can see from this photograph. The weather down there is often incredibly warm. Of course, this area also has the problem of hurricanes during hurricane season, but that would not be much of a concern for just a visitor, although you'd want to pay attention to the weather predictions, because there have been, hurricanes that have caught people by surprise. But the beaches there are just lovely. There are lots of hotels and condominiums and places to stay along the beach. And of course, during the summertime, during the high season, those prices are higher. But sometimes you can get a really good deal if you plan ahead or you buy into some kind of package. So I highly recommend the Florida beaches if you ever get to Florida. The next thing that I just absolutely had to include is Disney World. Now, this is a gigantic commercial site, of course, but I will tell you, having been there myself, that it is really a lot of fun. So I went with my kids when they were little. I honestly didn't think I would enjoy it that much. I thought I was doing it just for my kids. And then when I got there, I found that I had an incredible amount of fun. They call it the happiest place on earth, and they call it this part is called the Magic Kingdom. And it really is magical in some ways. So this castle, which is called Cinderella's Castle, at nighttime is lit up in different colors. It's all choreographed to music, and there are fireworks, and it is truly beautiful, really spectacular. The park itself is lovely. It's very clean. The park has all sorts of policies to make sure that people have the best experience. So everything's kept clean. The characters who are in these costumes, like Mickey here on the left, have to stay in character. There are tons of rides for people of all ages, from little kids all the way to adults. And of course, there are separate parks as well. And it is quite an adventure. It is also quite expensive. So again, this is something that you really have to plan for. It can be quite expensive, and but there are deals out there to be found. And I sound like a travel agent right now, but I think it's important to recognize that, this is something that's going to cost you a pretty penny, but it will be a lot of fun and something you won't forget. The last thing I wanted to mention in Florida is something that's a historic site. I'm a historian, so of course I really love going to historic sites, old cities, and this is considered the oldest city in the United States, founded in 1565 by the Spaniards, St. Augustine, Florida. I actually haven't been there myself, but it's on my list of things to do for sure. And it's also the site of where supposedly the Fountain of Youth is located, where Spanish explorers found the Fountain of Youth. So again, I haven't been there, but I hear wonderful things about it. One of my former students actually went there recently, and she's applying for a job as a tour guide now. She loved it so much. So this is definitely a place to see. Moving on to Georgia. Of course, again, Georgia has lots of things we could highlight, but I chose to just highlight one thing, and that is the city of Savannah. So Savannah was founded in 1733, and it's a gorgeous southern city. It was designed by James Oglethorpe, and it's designed in a pattern of squares. And so the city has lots of green space. So between streets, there are these little parks, many of them with fountains and benches, and of course, lovely large oak trees like the ones pictured here. In addition, the city has lots of these beautiful houses with wrought iron balconies. This is one of sort of the characteristics of this city. And when we get to New Orleans in a few minutes, you'll see that Savannah actually resembles New Orleans a lot with this kind of architecture, but New Orleans is a much larger city, and it has a grittier feel. Savannah definitely feels like a very genteel old southern city, and you can get some amazing food in Savannah as well. One of the best meals I think I've ever had was here in Savannah. Moving on is South Carolina and the city of Charleston. Again, another historic city founded in 1670. Again, this city is very, very classically Southern on the coast with lovely, lovely architecture, lots of palm trees, as you can see, and also great food. One of the dishes that we have in the South that I mentioned in one of the previous talks is shrimp and grits. And both in Savannah, Georgia, and Charleston, South Carolina, I've had some amazing shrimp and grits. So these cities are known for some good food as well. The other thing that's interesting and unique about Charleston is the heritage of some of the people there. So there are a group of people who are referred to as the Gullah, or the Gullah language is what they speak, or they some of them can speak. And these are people who were descended from slaves. And you can take tours, which are called Gullah tours, and they will take you to significant sites in the city that are related to African American history. And they'll tell you a little bit about this Gullah language, and even give you some examples of what it sounds like. And I did one of these tours a number of years ago, and it was very, very interesting, very different from what I'd experienced in other southern cities. All right, moving on to Tennessee. I see my slide got messed up here. I'm sorry. So one of the things that I think is just a must do in Tennessee is to visit the home of Elvis Presley. So I'm sure all of you know who Elvis Presley is. Very famous early rock and roll singer, born in Tupelo, Mississippi. And eventually he built this house in Tennessee known as Graceland. And it is a unique experience because, as one of my friends said, the interior looks like it was designed by a 12-year-old boy. Everything on the interior is just ornate and over the top, just extreme in its decor. Um, but it's a very interesting place to go. There is a lot there about Elvis Presley and his history, a lot about his early days as a young musical artist. And it's a really lovely museum, and you learn a lot about Elvis Presley, and you get to see some really interesting early footage of him when he was very young and just sort of a shy country boy who was making it big in the music scene. And of course, for everyone knows the story of Elvis, how he eventually became addicted to drugs, and he died at a relatively early age. Um, and so you really get to see kind of the tragedy of his life, where he started out as so innocent and pure and so incredibly talented, and then of course fame and the rigors of that profession ultimately undid him. But this is definitely something worth seeing. The other thing I mentioned in Tennessee that I think is worth seeing is the city of Memphis. Now, Memphis has a lot of things to see, but I'm focusing mostly on the Memphis's reputation for having great music and great barbecue. So this street is called Beale Street. People there pronounce it Bill Street, kind of in a southern way. But it is a street that's known for its bars and music venues. And so, Memphis claims that the blues were born here. That's, of course, debated by other cities, but they are known for having a very active music scene. And they're also known for having great barbecue. So, the South in general is known for barbecue, and there are a couple of cities who claim to be kind of the birthplace of barbecue, or who claim to have the best barbecue. But Memphis is definitely one of those places that has a reputation for having good food and good music. The other place that I thought would be very, very important if you wanted to take a tour of the South is the city of Nashville, which of course is associated with country music. Lots of country music legends got their start in Nashville, and it continues to be a city that is famous for country music, the Country Music Hall of Fame, and so on. And one of the things that's a landmark there is something called the Ryman Auditorium, and this has been referred to as the Mother Church of country music. So this was the home of the Grand Ole Opry from 1943 to 1974. And the Grand Ole Opry was this weekly musical concert that started in 1925. And for a number of years, the auditorium here was the location of the Grand Ole Opry. And so this is a building that has a strong connection to the history of contemporary and country music. Many of the greats that you would be familiar with, like Johnny Cash and Dolly Parton and let's see who else. I mean, Hank Williams, a lot of the bigs of country music would have gotten their start here. So this is a pretty important monument if you're interested in country music. And then the last thing I put in here for Tennessee is the Jack Daniel's Distillery. So this is a whiskey distillery. They give a tour. It's very fun. Even if you don't drink whiskey, you might like the smell of it. I don't really drink whiskey very much, but I do love the smell of it. And you get a tour that shows you how they make it, including they take you to this giant fermenting, I'm going to call it a barrel for lack of a better term, but it's enormous. And you can just smell the smell of this whiskey that's just that's fermenting, and it's a really powerful but delicious smell. This is the first registered distillery. Of course, there were lots of home distilleries before this, but in 1875, this is the first registered distillery. And as I said, they still produce whiskey. They give these lovely tours. But what's interesting, and I think this is still the case, the actual location of this distillery is inside of what we call a dry county, meaning a county, which was a government division of the state, right? And it is a place where you can't sell alcohol. So that we call those dry counties when it's a place that you can't sell alcohol. And so this distillery, at least I think it's still true, is in a dry county. So they can't even sell alcohol in their gift shop. You have to cross the county line in order to buy whiskey. But this is, I think, a fun stop. If you know, it's a little unique and something different. All right, moving on to Alabama, which is where I live. I decided to focus on the city of Montgomery and really focus on the monuments to the civil rights movement. So we do have some other things in Montgomery, to be sure, and there are other things in the state of Alabama that would be worth seeing. But Montgomery is famous as both the birthplace of the Civil War, because this is where the telegram was sent when Alabama seceded from the Union. And of course, the first White House of the Confederacy is located here in Montgomery. But in addition, it is also, of course, the birth of the civil rights movement. So this building here at the very bottom is the church on Dexter Avenue that Martin Luther King preached in. And so that is a famous historic monument. But we also have a number, and I should mention, of course, the bus boycott started here as well, right, with Rosa Parks. And so we have a number of museums that are dedicated to the civil rights movement and justice, right? So we have here a new Rosa Parks Museum. It may be 10 years old now, but it's still fairly new. We have a Freedom Riders Museum, which is about the Freedom Riders who were involved in the civil rights movement. We also have two museums / monuments that were created by the Equal Justice Initiative. One of them, it has a long name that I can never remember, but it's basically a monument to all of those who were killed by lynching. And so each of these pillars in the monument has the names. Each pillar is a state or a county, and it has the names of the people who were lynched, if their names are known. And there's a museum that goes along with it that features, more information about lynchings and basically a call to justice and a call to make these lynchings known, to honor these people who were victims of lynchings by acknowledging that these things occurred. So we have a number of relatively new museums and monuments dedicated to the civil rights movement here in Montgomery, and they've been really lovely additions to the city, and definitely worth seeing if you get out this way. All right, so getting to Louisiana, which is where I was born. Again, many things to see in Louisiana, but I'm going to focus on New Orleans and the surrounding area. So you can see here's one of those wrought iron balconies that looks very much like the picture I showed you from Savannah. So when you walk through this area, which is known as the French Quarter, the oldest part of the city of New Orleans, you see lots of these kinds of buildings. Usually not very tall, 2 or 3 stories with lovely wrought iron balconies. This is called Jackson Square, and this is St. Louis Cathedral. It's sort of the center or the front center of the French Quarter. And again, this is a lovely place. There's a restaurant near here that's very famous called Café Du Monde that serves those beignets that I told you guys about in a previous lecture. This square here is always surrounded by local people selling their art. And this whole area is just filled with history and food and culture. And it is a wonderful place to visit. And here you can see the streetcar. So the downtown area of New Orleans is connected to what's called the Garden District, in the uptown area by these streetcars, which have been running for decades and decades. And it's a lovely and easy way to travel between these areas of the city. And so if you ever come to visit, you can come and use the streetcar as a way of getting around, actually, to see a lot of the historic sites that you want to see. On the outskirts of New Orleans, there are a number of things you might want to do. On the Mississippi River, which literally would be right in front here on the other side of this road, there are old steamboats that you can take. You can pay to have little steamboat cruises. On the outskirts of the city and far miles and miles away, there are old plantation homes, all of which have become museums, and you can tour those and learn about life before the Civil War. And these are very interesting as well. So New Orleans and the surrounding area is definitely a place that's worth visiting, and you will get some of the best food you've ever had in your life in New Orleans. Okay, Kentucky. I picked a couple of places for Kentucky. Again, focusing on Louisville. So one of the things that you might think is kind of an odd thing to put in this presentation is the Louisville Slugger Museum. So I'm sure all of you are familiar with the Louisville Slugger. It is the most famous baseball bat used in baseball, which of course is one of America's favorite sports. And you can go to the Louisville Slugger Museum and you can learn not only about the history of the bat and their manufacturing of the bat, but you can actually watch bats being made. So they take you through a tour and you actually can see bats being made. There's an area where you can see which bats famous baseball players use. So baseball players go there and they pick the weight and the size and all that kind of stuff. I'm not an expert on this, that they like. And then, they've got their own little section where they keep those bats. So they can supply them with the exact bat that they chose and they want. And as a visitor, you can even request to have your own bat made. So you can pay and have a Louisville Slugger made for you individually. And you can even have your own signature carved onto the bat. So years ago when I went to visit the museum, I actually did that because I have a baseball bat that I like to keep in my house as a means of self-protection. If anybody broke into my house, I have my trusty baseball bat with my signature on it, which sounds crazy, but my grandmother used to do that. So I kind of decided to do it in honor of my grandmother. The other thing you might see in the town of Louisville, Kentucky is Churchill Downs. So Churchill Downs is the venue for the Kentucky Derby. So as you probably know, Kentucky is well known for its horse breeding and horse raising. So when you drive through areas of Kentucky, you'll drive through areas with beautiful green spaces and many horses. And these are people who breed and raise horses for racing and just for showing. And so it is horse country, and there are a lot of beautiful venues there with various things related to horses. And one of those is Churchill Downs, which hosts the annual Kentucky Derby, which will be on May 6th this year. All right. So Virginia has so many things I could have put on this list that I really had to just pick a couple of things. So of course, Virginia has tons and tons of historic homes, lots of historic sites, battlefields, those sorts of things. But I picked two historic homes to focus on that would be, of course, most well known to everybody in the audience. One of these is Mount Vernon. This was the home of George and Martha Washington. And then the other is Monticello, which was the home of Thomas Jefferson. So in both of these cases, these are, there are tours of these homes. These are very, very interesting, well worth a visit. They go through the homes, and you learn about, of course, the owners of the homes, and also you learn a lot about the way life was when they were living in those homes with the furniture and the day-to-day routine and so on. So I highly recommend visiting these. Of course, as I said, there are many other historic places in Virginia. There's Williamsburg, Virginia, which is an entire area, like a tiny city that has been renovated and maintained as a historic town. There's Jamestown, of course, one of the original settlements in the United States. So there are lots of other places in Virginia you could see as well. And if you only can go to Virginia, then, you could spend time, you could spend a lot of time looking at historic homes and various historic sites. And then, of course, there's Washington, D.C. And again, there are so many things to see in Washington, D.C. that it's sort of impossible to pick just one. So I've highlighted, some of the things that you guys might be familiar with. So, of course, there's the Smithsonian Institute, which is an entire collection of museums. So there's the natural history, American history, air and space. I mean, there are a whole bunch of museums that are part of the Smithsonian Institute, and these are all phenomenal. They're free. Actually, most of the museums in DC are free, which is really quite nice. But they're phenomenal museums. And then there's this monument, the tall one, right? The Washington Monument. Again, I think currently that is still open to the public. I'm not positive. I haven't tried to go in there in a while, but it is, one of the landmark sites of Washington, D.C. In addition, of course, there's the White House, which you can walk by, and you get pretty close actually. And obviously a very beautiful building, very significant landmark. We also have the Lincoln Memorial. Of course, many, many famous things have happened at the Lincoln Memorial, including, of course, famous speeches and marches and so on. It is truly overwhelming in size. When you get to see the statue up close, it is really enormous, and it's beautifully lit at night. So one of the things that I would recommend if you go to Washington, D.C. is that you walk around during the day and you see these things, but you also pay for a night tour. There are lots of affordable companies that do these night tours, and you go after dark and you're on a bus, and they take you to a lot of these monuments at night, and you get out and walk around and take pictures, but they're really beautifully lit at night, and I think it's a different experience. And then we also have the Jefferson Memorial. In addition to that, there are so many other museums. There are lots of monuments. So there's the monument to the Vietnam War, those who died during the Vietnam War. There are newer monuments dedicated to those who died during World War II. Recently, they opened up a museum on African American history. There are, I'm trying to even think. There are just so many monuments and museums. There's a Holocaust Museum. And I will say, if you get a chance to go to the Holocaust Museum, that is definitely worth your time. It is very depressing, as you might imagine. And when you're done, you will feel pretty overwhelmed by just the sadness of the museum. But it is brilliantly arranged, very well done, and definitely worth a visit. So Washington, D.C., you'll need a number of days to get through all the museums. But anything you can see is worth it. And it's a huge city, but it's very walkable. They also have really good public transportation. Not only do they have a subway, but they also have buses. And the last time I was there, you can download an app on your phone. And then when you're at a bus stop, you can put in the information. You can actually see when the next bus is. And so you know whether or not to wait or start walking. So it's really quite nice. So that is I guess I could have gone longer. I thought I was going to run out of time. That's the end of my presentation on things to see in the South. Again, I could have added so many more places. If you come to the South, you need to be prepared for the warm weather. It is usually warm in the South. We really don't have significant winters in the deep South. Now, if you go to that northern stretch of the South, they do get snow in places like DC and Virginia, but by and large, the South tends to be warm, so you'd want to be prepared for that. But it's a lovely place to visit. And if you rented a car, you could really hit a lot of famous monuments and spots as you drove through. Any questions for me? I'm happy to answer any questions if I can. No questions? Oh, let's see. Hold on. I need my glasses to read this. Could you please tell a little about the places from the book Gone with the Wind? Okay, yeah. I thought about doing something like that. So, yes, absolutely. So, of course, Atlanta is one of the cities that is featured in the book Gone with the Wind, and I didn't include Atlanta on the slide because it's a big city, so it's like New York or something, right? But there is actually a theater in the city where the movie Gone with the Wind premiered, and you can go there and do a little tour. It's a little Gone with the Wind museum, and sometimes they actually will show the movie there. Of course, some of the other places mentioned in the book or in the movie, Charleston, Savannah, um, those are also, of course, places that you could visit and that I mentioned. I'm not aware of anything dedicated to the book in those places, but I could be wrong. However, I have always been a great fan of the book and the movie Gone with the Wind, despite the complications with the narrative, right? I mean, slavery was not as nice as the movie makes it out to be. Um, but so I have visited sites on purpose because it was associated. And the only place I can think of really that I saw anything was in Atlanta, but I'm sure there are other places that I'm just unaware of. Um, but I bet if you were interested in doing that, you could look up, sort of a Gone with the Wind tour, and somebody has undoubtedly put that kind of thing together, or at least a list of places that they recommend for that kind of thing. So that's a good question. Any other questions? Let's see. Jazz. So I will say, yes, jazz is very popular. I'm going to say that in the South, the best place to go for jazz is New Orleans. There are a lot of jazz clubs in New Orleans every spring. In fact, very soon, this is going to start. There is a jazz fest in New Orleans, and it takes place over several weekends, and they get amazing performers, not just jazz, but they get musicians of all kinds to come and perform at Jazz Fest. So that happens in New Orleans every April. It's usually in the end of April. I can never make it because that's the end of the semester for me. So that's like the busiest time of year. But when I lived in New Orleans, I went to Jazz Fest. So yeah, I think your best shot for good jazz is New Orleans. And, in the French Quarter, there are lots of jazz venues. And some of these places are just like kind of old rundown bars, but they have amazing music if you're into jazz. Any other questions? I should also say I didn't include any kind of like national parks, state parks in this presentation because I was focusing more on sort of culture and history. But if you are a person who likes to hike, and do outdoorsy things, we have a lot of state and national parks in the South that are also worth visiting. Lots of places where you can go hiking and camping. A lot of these parks have cabins. So if you don't want to sleep in a tent outdoors, you can rent a cabin. Um, so there are lots of places that you can do that kind of stuff as well. Also, I'm seeing, are there any popular road trip destination routes in the South? So there are also a lot of places you can go rafting in the South, or kayaking. So there are some rivers that are conducive to that kind of activity as well. So that's another thing. We have although it gets very hot down here, we have a mild climate in terms of we don't get severe weather like snow, and so all of the waterways tend to be pretty easy going. They're not really rough, and so there are places you can go rafting and kayaking. Some of the top restaurants in the South. I'm not familiar with a lot of top restaurants, but I will tell you that there's one in New Orleans that's called Commander's Palace. And it is in New Orleans. It's right across the street, actually, from an above ground cemetery, which is kind of a unique thing you see in New Orleans as well. So the water table is very high in New Orleans, and so you can't bury people underground, and so they're built in these above ground mausoleums, and that's a feature of the New Orleans landscape, is all of these cemeteries with these giant ornate above ground mausoleums. And this one famous restaurant called Commander's Palace is located directly across the street from one of these cemeteries, and it's known not only for its spectacular food, but it's known for its spectacular service. So this is the kind of place where, the minute a crumb hits the tablecloth, someone is coming to scoop it up, and the service is just impeccable. Um, so that's a place that I would definitely recommend if you ever get down to New Orleans. And I'm writing that in the chat there, Commander's Palace. Popular road trip destinations. I-10 is the interstate that runs along the southern coast. And so it'll get you from Florida all the way to Texas and beyond. And so it is sort of our version of Route 66, I guess, except that it's the interstate. So the problem, of course, is that you're driving 70 miles an hour or 80 miles an hour. So you're not going to be like seeing things on the side of the road and just easily pulling off. But it is a good connector. And so, you could start in Florida and, if you had the time to kind of slowly drive along I-10 and just pull off wherever you wanted to, you could visit beaches, historic homes, all sorts of things, and it would take you through several states. So that would be definitely something I would recommend if somebody's looking for a road trip. Anything else? I will say in terms of amusement, we have lots of amusement parks and water parks in the South, again, because it's so hot. There are parks where people can go and, most of the rides are based around water. So, for example, there's something called a log ride where you're in this like thing that looks like a log and you go down the chute and you just dive into water, and you can go down, around curves and things, or, parks where maybe you sit on something and you slide down a slide in water, lots of water slides, that kind of thing. Let's see. Where can you visit mountains? So beginning in North Alabama into Tennessee, that is the beginning of the Smoky Mountains. And so in Tennessee, there are really lovely, lovely mountains. West Virginia also, again, great places to hike. The Appalachian Trail is a very famous hiking trail. It takes people, I think, 6 months if they do it from beginning to end. I think it's 6 months. Maybe it's a year, but it's, I know people who have done pieces of the Appalachian Trail, and that's supposed to be a really nice experience for if you're a good hiker. But yeah, there are lots of places like that, but not in the bottom part of the South, that we're coastal. So you have to go further north for that. But once you hit like Tennessee and above, you'll start hitting some mountains for sure. Let's see. Baseball. Who travels to the South more often? That's a good question. I'm not sure. I think probably Southerners travel in the South more, and I'll tell you why. I think people from other parts of the country have a bad impression of the South. I mentioned in my first presentation a couple of weeks ago that there are a lot of negative stereotypes about the South based on our history, and our, the race relations here, and the fact that the South was on the wrong side of the Civil War. And some of those, things are partly true. So some of the problems that the South has are definitely remnants of the past. But it has meant that people misjudge the South. So, I think I told you in the first presentation, there's an impression that people in the South are dumb. We do have higher rates of illiteracy than in other places, but we also have some stellar universities and institutions down here, and a lot of incredibly smart people. So I think maybe people don't come down here sometimes because of those sorts of things. And it, politically and socially, the South tends to be more conservative. So that's a turnoff for people who might be of a more liberal bent. I will also say that if you love to golf, there are a ton of golfing courses here in the South. So of course, in Georgia, there's the Masters, where they have the big golfing tournament every year. But there's also what's called the Robert Trent Jones Trail, which is a number of golf courses in the South. And I'm not a golfer, but there's supposed to be some of the best golf courses, we have here in the South. So, yeah, if you're into golfing, that's definitely something you can do. Um, let's see, mountains. I already mentioned mountains in North Tennessee and moving north from Tennessee. Baseball. Um, Atlanta has a big team, the Atlanta Braves. But baseball's kind of big all over the South. Baseball and college football are very big in the South. So um, pretty much any area is going to have a baseball team within driving distance. We have a minor league team called the Biscuits, which is not a cookie as in Britain, but a biscuit in the United States is like a bready kind of roll. And so our mascot is called the Biscuits, the Montgomery Biscuits. In Savannah, they have a team called the Savannah Bananas. That's a minor league team also. So there are a lot of baseball teams in the South, both minor league and major league. If you're into baseball, there are plenty of places you can go and enjoy that. Resorts on the Gulf of Mexico. Florida has some places on the Gulf of Mexico or rather, Alabama actually has places on the Gulf of Mexico that are cheaper than Florida, but the beaches are better in Florida. I'll be honest. I mean, there's some nice beaches in Alabama for sure, but I think generally speaking, the beaches are probably nicer in Florida. But if you're just going for sun and you don't care about getting in the water, you don't care if the sand is perfectly white, there are very nice beaches in Alabama and some in Mississippi too, though not quite as much. I think just in general because of the way the coastline works with the water gets murkier and the beaches get less white as you move toward New Orleans, and they're whiter and the water's bluer when you go toward Florida. So let's see where to go on vacation with kids. Okay. Good question. So again, I think, Disney World is the place people go with kids, right? But as I said before, it is kind of expensive and it's exhausting, right? Because there's so much to do and you want to make sure you're getting as much as you can while you're there. So I personally would recommend you don't go there with really small kids. I'm not sure they can appreciate it enough, and you're spending money on kids who maybe aren't really getting the most out of it. So I would wait until they're a little bit older. But it is definitely kind of the thing that people do. The other thing I think is any of the beaches. Those are good to do with kids as well. As long as you have a hotel nearby where everybody can wash off and kids can take a nap. Kids can burn off a lot of energy at the beach. Let's see, New Orleans. I mean, some of the historic cities I think they're very walkable, but maybe not so much for kids to do. Although every big city these days in the United States tends to have like a kids museum or a science museum or something like that. So you can probably find something for your kids to do in every one of these cities, even when you're going there for another reason. For example, because you're interested in the history of the city. New Orleans has like an insectarium, an insect museum. They have a really wonderful aquarium. Many of these cities have wonderful aquariums. Atlanta has a wonderful aquarium. I think Virginia has a wonderful aquarium. So a lot of these places have nice aquariums. And then they often have science museums or nature museums, natural history museums, those kinds of things, art museums. All of the major cities that I mentioned have really lovely art museums. So I think you have to do a little bit of investigating at each city to decide what's appropriate for kids of the age that you have, because not everything's going to work for all kids. Any other questions? I guess any of the natural parks, like I said, I didn't really go into those, but the natural parks, the national parks, the state parks, as I said, a lot of them do have cabins. That's kind of a fun thing to do with kids. Some of them have, lakes where you can rent boats, or, maybe you can rent bikes to go on bike rides. things like that. But even just if it's not serious hiking, if it's just walking basically through the woods, that's something that you can do with kids as well. Any other questions? Oh, okay. I think we're done then. Thank you so much for having me. And if you have any questions later, you can always, contact the moderators, and they can shoot me a question and I can answer it later. I'm happy to do that.